Hi guys, this is Dr. Momsilovich with your lecture 13.2 on succession. So when we think about what a community is the compilation of all of the living organisms within a given area. So classical ecology theory states that in a given physical environment, successional processes will stop when the community has reached equilibrium, which is called the climax community. So succession is the process where certain species will live in an area and create an environment suitable for other species, which will allow more species to move there until you get to a stable community, which is the climax community, that is no longer changing. There's two different types of succession. The first is called primary succession, and this starts when you have essentially bare rock. There's no soil, there's no nutrients, there's nothing. And from that bare rock, eventually, over hundreds and hundreds of years generally, you can end up with your climax community. On the other hand, secondary succession is something that happens when you have something that has disturbed that initial community, and the process is starting over, but you're not starting with bare rock, you're at least starting with soil and a few nutrients and things like that. They're both going to lead to that climax community, which is that stable final ecosystem. So there are a few different characteristics of a climax community. So this is a community where the vegetation is tolerant of the environmental conditions. It's well adapted to live in that environment, those temperatures, that amount of precipitation, those types of things. A climax community has a wide diversity of species. It's a well-drained spatial structure and a lot of complex food chains. So there's a lot of different species, a lot of different interactions, and they affect each other in different ways. You can also say that a climax ecosystem is balanced. So if a long time ago when you were younger, someone said that nature is balanced, we could sort of refer to a climax community in the same way. The amount of primary production supports the amount of respiration and other activities. The food webs within that community are balanced so that there are enough of each level of trophic organisms to support the next. And they're balanced because all of those climax plants will only be replaced by more individuals of that species, so that there's constant turnover, but it's balanced, where you have the same species richness and the same species evenness in that community at all times. Individuals in the climax stage are replaced by others of the same kind, and so you have species composition that maintains equilibrium. And it is an index of the climate of the area. So the life or growth forms indicate the climate type. So if you think about a desert, there's going to be less types of species and things like that, and different types, than there would be in a tropical rainforest or a deciduous forest or a grassland. In that way, it's also balanced. So let's talk about the process of primary succession in a little bit more detail. Primary succession happens in a very specific way. So the first species to be able to colonize an area are what we call pioneer species. And these species are going to be able to live in areas that don't have any soil and not a lot of nutrients and things like that. They can live on bare rock. So these would be small plants with high dispersal rates. So it would be things like algae, lichens, and moss that are dispersed, wind dispersed spores that allow them to move to new locations. These organisms have an ability to modify bedrock to initiate the formation of soil. So they might break down that rock a little bit and start making some soil material. And also as wind is moving, there's particles that are getting trapped underneath those plants. And as those plants die, their nutrients are going back into that soil material and creating a building layer that other organisms can then come in and start utilizing. So the pioneer species are going to create a more habitable environment for other species. Next, you have what are called intermediate species, where you have slightly larger plants that are very sun tolerant because there are no larger plants to shade them from the sunlight. So these are usually really herbaceous plants, meaning that they don't have a woody material. So it's not like trees. It would be things that are growing low to the ground, bushes and things like that. So most of their body is going to be soft and not hard like wood. And these organisms are able to increase the biomass of the area. In a climax community, you have plants and diversity that represents the equilibrium community for the physical environment. So this can be a lot of the time woody plants, so trees and things like that, things that are slower growing and that are more competitive for that environment. The climax community is going to look different depending on the biome in which it's located. So if it's a desert biome, the climax community is going to look like small shrubs and some cacti and things like that. If we're talking about a deciduous forest, then we're going to have large mature trees with a green undergrowth. And in a grassland, you're going to have grasses with a few interspersed trees. So the climax community will always be representative of the climate and the biome of that area. Ecologists break the process of primary succession up into 6 different stages. So the first is bare rock, and then you have the introduction of mosses and grasses. And then in the third stage, the introduction of perennial grasses. So these are grasses that live for more than 1 year, followed by the fourth stage where you have woody pioneer species, and then the introduction of fast-growing trees. And then finally, in the sixth stage, you have your climax forest. So as you move through these stages of succession, the biomass and the biodiversity, as well as the amount of soil, increases from that first stage through to the sixth stage. So sometimes you can have something happen, some type of a disturbance that will take the climax community or this community from that sixth stage down to the third stage or the second stage, things like that. And in that case, succession has to start over. In that case, it's not called primary succession. Instead, it's called secondary succession. So secondary succession occurs where you have a severe disturbance or removal of pre-existing community. So this can occur from either natural or man-made causes. So the first would be something like fire, landslides, earthquakes, tsunamis, droughts, etc., that remove all of that climax community from that area, and the community then has to rebuild itself and will eventually rebuild back up into that climax community. Another way this can happen is through man-made causes, which could be deforestation or agriculture. And in agriculture, you can have what we call old field succession. So if you have a field that's been used as a pasture for livestock or for a farm field and you're no longer using it, then over time, very slowly and gradually, the surrounding environment will come in and take over that environment again and move it back to that natural climax community. So secondary succession is just where you have some type of either natural or man-made disturbance that changes the species in that area, and you have to have that community build itself back up to the climax community again. So an example of this would be found in North Carolina in what's called the Duke Forest. And this was some farmland that was used for agriculture, and over time it wasn't used anymore. And scientists were able to watch this environment and see how quickly it was able to return to its natural state. So in the first few years, it took about 3 years to start getting some of those smaller herbaceous plants to move in. It took about 19 to 30 years to start having some of those fast-growing trees. It took up to 70 years for some of those. And then after that, those longer-lived, more competitive trees were able to move in, but it can take up to and over 100 years for that community to get back to that climax community. Given what scientists know about the succession of different types of ecosystems, they can create models to determine how long succession might take and the process of succession for any given area. So you would put a few different types of variables into your model to see how succession might occur in that specific place. So for example, you would put in your type of climate, the type of soil and the amount, which would tell you the types of nutrients and the types of plants it can support, as well as the biodiversity that is nearby that is available to recolonize that area. You would then put into your simulation whether there's going to be fire and how likely it is, the size, how it's going to ignite, how it's going to spread, and how severe it might be. Wind, and how that could affect something like fire, the landscape and geology and rock formations and things like that, and use that information to estimate the effects of different types of disturbances, as well as how quickly and in what order you would expect your ecosystem to bounce back. There are lots of different types of ecological succession models that have been developed. One in particular is called the Zelig model, and this was created by a scientist named Mark Urban. And his model allows you to take all of the factors that we talked about on the previous slide, but also take into account the time it takes for certain types of trees to grow, so oak trees or pine trees or whatever types of trees are in your ecosystem, as well as how many individuals you would expect one of those trees to produce through reproduction in its lifetime, and use that to sort of estimate how long that succession process is going to take. So models like this are similar to what you guys have been working with in lab, but in the ones you've been using in lab, we sort of know all of the parameters ahead of time, and you're just using it as a way to create hypothetical situations. In these models, we're taking hypothetical data and saying, if this happens and this happens, then maybe what's the effect? And so ecological succession models are created to try to give us a better idea of how an ecosystem is going to recover from a disturbance. There's this really interesting hypothesis called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis that suggests that the local species diversity, so the species richness, is maximized when you have ecological disturbances that are neither too rare nor too frequent, so when they sort of occur at a middle ground. And the reasoning behind this is that if you have a climax community, then it's only made up of those climax species, and you're missing out on those pioneer and intermediate species. So if you have disturbances that occur occasionally at an intermediate level, so not too rare or not too frequent, then you will have the most diverse possible environment, because you will have such a diverse mixture of different types of species, and therefore that is the best case scenario for maximizing that the diversity in those areas. related to that idea is this idea of that habitat heterogeneity increases species diversity. So if it's a heterogeneous environment, it means that it has a lot of different attributes to it. So if you have a lot of different types of vegetation, that allows for more species of animals and bacteria and fungi and things like that to live. And so you have to take into account not only the living, but also the abiotic factors. So climate and topography and soil composition and things like that are going to affect the heterogeneity of an ecosystem. But you can take all of these different things into consideration, and the more heterogeneous your environment, so the more different specialized little niches within that environment, you're going to have more species diversity. So something that's interesting to note is that even the most remote old growth forests, so something like the tropical rainforest down in South America, most areas have actually been impacted by humans in some way in the past. So the figure up in the upper left-hand corner of your screen is showing areas that have been touched by deforestation, either before 1967 or from 1968 to 2008. And those areas, you'll notice, are near roads and waterways, because that makes it easier to get those cut down trees out of the forest and to industrial centers. However, if you look at the figure in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can see areas that were colonized by people in the past. So these are tribes and things that colonized these areas and lived in them, but since then they no longer live there, and the forest has sort of taken back over. You can also see on the map in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen different parts of the Amazon rainforest that have been impacted by different crops. And so even the most remote and the most sort of pristine environments actually have been affected by human activities, but not to a point in the past where they were completely destroyed. And so that's something we can learn from and learn how to live in harmony with our environment without completely destroying it.